didn't expect a kind of Spanish Inquisition.
Nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition!
The Branch Davidian disaster.
There is a battle between good and evil, between every individual and themselves, you know, between what's right is right, it's Christ, and what's wrong is wrong, that's the devil.
Founded in 1955 by Benjamin Rodin, the General Association of Branch Davidian Seventh-day Adventists is widely regarded as a doomsday cult. Rodin died in 1978, and his wife Lois assumed his place as Davidian prophet. That was until 1981, when Vernon Howell, who changed his name to David Koresh, arrived, amassing growing influence in the organization until 1987, when he spun off his own sect of Davidians.
They prepared you for war because that's what the belief was. Everything had to be military style. My mom's job was to sew the vest, bulletproof vests that they were using for protection. There was just this level of an impending doom.
Koresh's Branch Davidians assimilated the original group by force, and in 1993, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms attempted to raid the Mount Carmel Center Ranch. The ensuing 51-day standoff and firefight resulted in the deaths of 4 ATF agents as well as 82 Branch Davidians, including 28 children.
Houston and the world watched as the Davidian compound and the cult itself burned.
Because the burns are a very painful way to die.
But Dr. David Olson says many of the cult members may have died from smoke inhalation, not the fire itself.
The time that fire was set, they may have had literally just a minute or two to escape.
Abuse in the Catholic Church and its cover-up.
We have confidence in the victory of good over evil. Fight the real enemy.
In 1992, Irish singer Sinead O'Connor appeared on Saturday Night Live, and in one of the show's most controversial moments, tore up a photo of Pope John Paul II. She claimed it was in response to the Catholic Church's concerted efforts to cover up disturbing cases of abuse against minors by those in its ranks, including priests, nuns, and more.
At the outset, I apologize once again to all those who have been sexually abused as minors by priests. Today, that apology is made in a special way with heartfelt sorrow to those abused by John Gagan.
O'Connor's career took a heavy blow, but over time, her protest has been regarded as highly prescient. More and more cases of stomach-churning misconduct were exposed over the years, most notably by the Spotlight division of the Boston Globe newspaper. Their reporting led to 5 Catholic priests being convicted and sentenced to prison in 2002.
I mean, we went into this essentially because the boss said, look into it. You do what the boss says. And the church had always said, there's just 1 or 2 bad priests out there. It's an isolated problem. We thought, okay, we've heard there may be 6 or 7, and then suddenly we thought, could there be a dozen? And then we seemed to have 20. And by the time we were confident publishing our first story about the scale of the problem, we said there were at least 70. We now know there were hundreds in the Boston Archdiocese alone.
30 Years' War.
The Peasants' War is just a name, and it gives the wrong impression. There wasn't a war as we understand the term, rather an unknown number of isolated uprisings. These peasants' revolts constitute a tradition going back into the 14th and 15th centuries.
This devastating Central European religious conflict saw as many as an estimated 8 million deaths over its 3-decade span, both military and civilian. The war was spurred on by the 16th century rise of Protestantism in Europe, which was perceived as threatening centuries of Catholic dominance.
The success of the Prague defenestration can best be understood if we look at the Bohemian Act of Confederation of 1619. Here, we have a document in which the Bohemian estates define what they want in terms that we will later call a state.
It began in earnest when Emperor Ferdinand II, the Catholic King of Bohemia, aka modern-day Czech Republic, was replaced by Frederick V of the Palatinate, a Protestant. From there, what had started as a civil war within the Holy Roman Empire snowballed into a region-wide conflict. The 30 Years' War forever altered the social and political trajectory of Central Europe, and all because Ferdinand had intended to stomp out Catholicism.
Perhaps Frederick the Great put it best. Each man should be blessed as he thinks fit. And so religion is shifted firmly into the private sphere.
The mass deaths of Jonestown.
In Guyana, a California congressman, 3 American journalists, and a woman were gunned down, murdered by a gang of fanatics. Congressman Leo Ryan had gone to the town of Georgetown in Guyana to investigate allegations that some young Californians were being held prisoners and virtual slaves by a mysterious cult called the People's Temple.
For context, the actions of Jim Jones and his People's Temple led to the single largest deliberate loss of American life until the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001. Jones, a preacher who formed his cult in Indianapolis in 1954, had moved it to a rented plot of land in Guyana, owing to increasing backlash to allegations of abuse and violence.
There were some cult members with him who said they wanted to leave, but one of them pulled a gun and started shooting at the other defectors. And then a truckload of people pulled up and they started shooting too. Ryan was killed. So was NBC News correspondent Don Harris, along with his cameraman Bob Brown.
These allegations became especially pronounced as the movement moved further and further away from mainstream Christianity. On November 17, 1978, an investigative visit by U.S. Congressman Leo Ryan turned deadly when security guards killed Ryan and 4 others. That night, Jones commanded his 918 congregants to drink cyanide-laced Flavor Aid, commonly mistaken for Kool-Aid, while he and his personal aide, Annie Moore, allegedly took their own lives.
He had babies and children go first, and they would take the syringe, and nurse or other people who were administering it would simply put it into the person's mouth, and they would swallow it and then give them a small drink of punch to wash it down.
The establishment of the Canadian residential school system.
2015, the estimate was about 4,100 children likely died attending these schools. We believe that number could be as high as 15,000 now. We do know from testimony and from records that students died of negligence, they died of starvation, they died of disease, and increasingly there's a belief that their deaths were deliberate in some cases.
In the time between the so-called Indian Act was passed in 1876 to the time the last school shut its doors in 1997, irreparable damage was done to Canada's Indigenous communities. Without their families' consent, children born to Indigenous families were forcibly placed into harsh, punishing boarding schools where their culture, identities, and histories were stripped from them in the hope that they would assimilate. The residential schools had a disturbingly high mortality rate, possibly in the thousands, partially attributed in the years since to insufficient measures to curb the spread of tuberculosis.
I don't think our parents knew what was happening in those schools. They didn't know the horrors. They didn't know the loneliness, and the deprivation of food, and they didn't know any of that.
And we never talked about it.
And that wasn't talked about after you went home during the summer.
Although the Canadian government and the Catholic Church have apologized since, the detrimental effects of the residential school system have trickled down through the ages and remain a black mark on the country's history.
Federal government and key ministers in that government have issued, heartfelt apologies. But at the same time, Justin Trudeau's government is in litigation with residential school survivors in court, and he has so far ignored calls for a national investigation into the deaths. So I think for a lot of people, it's tough to square what those apologies mean when it comes to concrete action that Indigenous leaders have said would be necessary to move forward.
The troubles in Northern Ireland.
The current conflict in Northern Ireland has now lasted for nearly 10 years. For much of that time, politicians in the Irish Republic have refrained from questioning Ulster's status as part of the United Kingdom.
While scholars and historians are quick to dispel notions that this ethno-nationalist conflict stemmed primarily from religious tensions, it's inarguable that they played an integral role in its escalation. Essentially, Protestant Unionists and Loyalists butted heads with Irish nationalists and Republicans.
Do you believe that there can be permanent peace in Ireland as long as Britain remains in the north?
I honestly don't believe that there could be, because there will be in future generations people who are prepared to take up arms, even though they won't have the support of the vast majority to take up arms in such a situation.
The Unionists wanted Northern Ireland to remain part of the United Kingdom, and the nationalists vociferously supported the founding of a united Ireland. The conflict turned deadly, and over several decades, just over 3,500 people were killed, over half of whom were civilians. The Troubles may not have explicitly have been divided along religious lines, but those lines formed the basis of the conflicts to begin with.
In 1998, peace came with an agreement that maintained Northern Ireland as part of the United Kingdom, but brought Catholic nationalist party Sinn Féin into government in a power-sharing arrangement with its former loyalist foes.
It has been a remarkable journey. We're now in the control, effectively, of one of the most successful peace processes in the world today.
The litany of disturbing allegations against the Church of Scientology.
Scientology is now facing harsh new criticism from one of its own. A former high-ranking official, Deborah Cook, blasted the church leadership in a weekend email to thousands of current and former members. She targets Scientology's fundraising practices and calls on members to scale back on donations.
Oof, where do we even begin with this one? As you're probably already aware of, L. Ron Hubbard's new religious movement has seemingly been a lightning rod for controversy since its December 1953 inception. While the organization is protected under religious grounds in some countries, like Australia and the United States, others, like France, have labeled it an extremist cult.
Nick was labeled a suppressive person. His mother says church officials actively and repeatedly pressured her to, quote, disconnect from her son, to cut off ties completely. She feared that refusing meant she, too, would be labeled a suppressive person and would likely lose her relationship with her daughter, Ashley, still a devout Scientologist.
Over the years, the church and its numbers have been found guilty of domestic espionage, coercion, and fraud. It's also repeatedly intimidated those who have dissented from its ranks, as well as its secular critics. Perhaps most disturbingly of all, rumors persist of rampant human trafficking, as well as other forms of abuse by officials within the church.
A former Scientology member with local ties is suing the church, claiming repeated abuse. According to the lawsuit, the girl lived at the spiritual headquarters in Clearwater from age 6 to 12 in the 1980s and early 90s. She claims she was forced to work long hours and was the victim of abusive rituals.
Witch trials in the early modern period.
The Puritans settled in Salem about 70 years before the outbreak of the Salem witch trials. They had fled England, where they had been persecuted for their religious beliefs by the Anglican Church.
Puritans are not fans of this church, not because it's too strict, but because it's not strict enough.
One of the most damning religious panics of all time. This dark era of human history saw 100,000 people prosecuted for witchcraft, of whom as many as 60,000 were executed, peaking in the 16th and 17th centuries and taking place primarily in Europe and North America. Friends, families, and neighbors turned on each other.
A court is convened in the town of Salem. Tituba is brought before a court, before a council, and they ask her, "Are you a witch? Did you bewitch the Paris girls?"
One of the peculiarities of the Salem witch trials is that those who confess are granted clemency.
If you maintained your innocence, but you were found guilty, then you were put to death.
Most of the accused were women, and the crimes they were charged with are theorized to have stemmed from war and food shortages. People needed someone to blame. Most infamous of all were the Salem witch trials on American soil, which were the result of growing tensions between the Puritans and Church of England supporters.
Thomas Putnam files 12 legal complaints and testifies against 24 individuals who are accused of witchcraft, but his daughter Anne takes it all one step further.
Anne Putnam, in the end, actually levies accusations against 48 people, so nearly 1/4 of all the people who get accused of witchcraft in Salem Village.
Crusades. The Crusades were seemingly the religious wars to end all religious wars. Largely engineered by the Latin Church, the Crusades consisted of a series of military operations in the Holy Land, located between the Mediterranean Sea and Jordan River. The Crusades were intended as a way for Christianity to retake Jerusalem and the larger Levant as a whole, ripping it from Muslim rule. The effort to control the geographical region took a serious hit in 1187 when the Sultan Saladin and his Ayyubid army recaptured Jerusalem and restored Muslim dominance. Despite the war and bloodshed, the Latin Church's attempts were ultimately for naught, having failed in its original goal. Spanish Inquisition.
Nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition. Our chief weapon is surprise. Surprise and fear. Fear and surprise. Our two weapons are fear and surprise and ruthless efficiency. Our three weapons are fear and surprise and ruthless efficiency and an almost fanatical devotion to the Pope. Our four. No.
The old Monty Python joke has a ring of truth to it. No one expected the Spanish Inquisition. At one point, the Catholic Church was known to carry out inquisitions, a form of ecclesiastical court in which justice would be served solely on its Christian terms, prosecuting such violations as heresy, apostasy, blasphemy, and the aforementioned witchcraft. The Spanish Inquisition was an exceptionally trigger-happy period.
Cardinal, read the charges.
You are hereby charged that you did on diverse nights commit heresy against the Holy Church. My own man.
That's enough!
Its most devastating moments came in the form of the Alhambra Decree, which outlawed Judaism and Islam under the Spanish monarchy. Hundreds of thousands of people were forcibly converted to Christianity, expelled from Spain's territory entirely, or even executed.
Do you confess?
I don't understand what I'm accused of.
Then we shall make you understand. Biggles. Bench. The cushions.
Which moment in our video shocked you the most? Be sure to let us know in the comments below.
Subscribe and ring the bell to be notified about our latest videos.